Dear students, dear professors, welcome to the opening session of the Master LLM in International Legal Studies, organized by Deusto Law School. We are extremely happy to launch the second edition of this forward-looking academic program. This year, in spite of the consequences of the global pandemic we all are suffering, we have students from Kenya, from Cameroon, from Brazil, from the US, from Germany, and from Finland. Welcome to Deusto. Last Saturday, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attacks that took place in US soil in 2001. These events are still in our collective memory and have conditioned the way in which both international relations and international law have developed. As a reaction, the US launched the so-called War on Terror to fight global terrorism and invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. The ramifications of these military interventions are dramatic and have challenged significantly international law, particularly international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The creation of the Guantanamo Bay Detention camp, a legal limbo in which hundreds of so-called enemy combatants have been detained. The adoption of the US Patriot Act, a law that paved the way for systematic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Actually, some European countries also joined this attempt to place security first to the detriment of human rights, the systematic use of torture and ill treatment, the creation of secret prisons. These are only some of the side effects of the war on terror that we are still witnessing in different parts of the world, including Europe. Well, today, to reflect on these issues, we have today with us two excellent speakers, one from the other side of the Atlantic, although she lives in San Sebastian, Linda Wood, and Joana Abrisketa. Joana Abrisketa, she's professor of international law at Deusto Law School, and she's also coordinator of the NOAA program, the Network on Humanitarian Assistance, the Master on Humanitarian Assistance. She has worked extensively on migration issues in Europe and beyond. And Linda, she holds a JD from the University of California, Berkeley Law School. She has worked as a mediator and arbitrator in some developing democracies in post-conflict countries such as Afghanistan. So she has experience in Afghanistan. And Linda also cooperates with our Master in International Legal Studies. So thank you both. And Joana, first, you have the floor.
Dear Professor Felipe Gomez, thank you so much for your kind words. I would like also to express my gratitude to the Director of the Master of Law in International Legal Studies, Professor Emilio Armaza, for inviting Linda and myself to the opening conference of the LLM. It's a genuine pleasure and a great honor to inaugurate the LLM. And it also constitutes a wonderful opportunity of joining colleagues, friends, and even students, former students, and the new students to whom I would like to warmly welcome to the University of Deusto, to the Faculty of Law. The title of this conference is very accurate: Afghanistan, Reflections from the International Law Perspective. Still, contemporary international law does not provide a very clear and conclusive response to the situation of Afghanistan. The only thing we can do is realize about which are the conceptual boundaries of international law which have prompted from the crisis. Some of them were hidden and others were already evident along these 20 years. I will refer to 8 branches of international law directly affected by the disaster we are facing. Firstly, the casualties, the suffering, the injuries of the civilian population who is being attacked by the Taliban. I mean the over 1,000 civilians killed in the last month, enforced disappearances, and an estimated 200,000 people who have been forced to leave Afghanistan during this year. How are they protected by international law? They have nothing. International humanitarian law would be the branch of international law protecting the civilian population, taking into account that we are in front of an internal armed conflict. However, how to require the application of international humanitarian law to non-state actors? This is the question. Who are these actors? Do they have the legitimacy towards international humanitarian law? They did not sign the Geneva Conventions from 1949, which is the main, regime on international humanitarian law. Neither they did sign the protocols from 1977. So nowadays it is a pending subject. They are not the state parties. Even more, the Taliban is listed as a terrorist organization by the UN Security Council in Resolution 1267, which underlies, on the other hand, that all parties, this means state parties to the Geneva Conventions and non-state parties, have or must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law in all circumstances. So this means that the Security Council knows that the application of international law is intended to be applied not only to the state parties, but also to non-state parties. The problem is that they did not agree, they did not consent on the Geneva Convention rules, so it may be very difficult to ask them for the application of international humanitarian law. So non-state actors and the applicability of international humanitarian law. The second point I wanted to mention there is a complot against me, probably. No sé por qué no funciona. No, yes. Is about the humanitarian aid system and the role of humanitarian actors in this country. It is striking that the United States announced the provision of millions of dollars on humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan. And on the other hand, they have left the country, they have withdrawn. So the question here, apart or leaving aside this contradiction, we are leaving, but we will provide you with humanitarian assistance. The question I wanted to refer to here is, how do the humanitarian actors, the NGOs and international organizations, because the aid will be channeled through these organizations, accede to some places to provide aid? Is there any obligation to accept the access of humanitarian organizations by the Taliban? How will NGOs reach places which are totally unsafe? What would be the legal consequence if the Taliban do not accept the entry of NGOs? How can we guarantee a humanitarian safe place? And even more, is there a human right to ask for assistance and to receive assistance by the victims? It is another pending question. The third one, let's see, now, yes, is the international criminal responsibility, individual criminal responsibility, particularly in this case because of the commission of crimes against humanity and war crimes. The new prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, made a statement last August on the escalating violence in Afghanistan. And he recalled that pursuant to the appeals chamber decision on March 2020, his office, I mean the prosecutor, may exercise its jurisdiction over and investigate any act, meaning crimes against humanity or war crimes committed within the territory of Afghanistan since 2003, because in 2003, Afghanistan decided to become party, state party of the Statute of Rome. So in this case, every crime committed in the territory of Afghanistan could be prosecuted through the International Criminal Court, not only the ones committed by the Taliban, but also the ones committed by the US soldiers. This has, I mean, quite strong implications for the US, because probably if the prosecutor wants, he could initiate a process against the US soldiers because of the crimes, or presumably the crimes committed by the US soldiers. We have to follow up how the International Criminal Court processes in this case. The fourth point I wanted to mention is the language of human rights, which is being used in this case. The UN Security Council passed a resolution during last August, and in that resolution, the Security Council reaffirmed the importance of upholding human rights, including those of women and children. This is a very short statement as regards human rights. It refers continually and constantly exclusively to women and children. Universal human rights language is broader. It is not encapsulated to women and children, even if women and children are being victims of the violations of human rights. What about the human rights of the human rights defenders? What about the summary executions? What about the right to food, or the right to education, or the rights of refugees and of internally displaced people who are still in Afghanistan? The compliance with human rights and the adherence to human rights reaches the whole regime of civil and political rights, and also economic, social, and cultural rights. And the fifth point is related to the international community's response to the statement or to the recognition of the new government. There is a political settlement, and there should be a recognition of the new Taliban government as such. What does the international law doctrine say about the recognition of new governments? Well, one of the guiding principles is the principle of the effectiveness. This means that as far as the authorities demonstrate that they are effectively controlling a territory, they can be recognized as the new government of a country. Therefore, if the Taliban are effectively controlling, running the country, organizing the country, do foreign states have to recognize this new government? And moreover, which is the tolerance threshold of the Western liberal countries, the European countries, as regards to the non-adherence of this new government to the standards of the rule of law? Is there any condition apart from the effective control which should be established as regards to the recognition of new governments in the world in general? So this is another question, another doctrine which should be developed. The sixth aspect I will refer to is the legacy and the future of NATO and the European Union and their role as regards to military forces. Not by coincidence, in the State of the Union address given last Wednesday by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she affirmed the EU is a unique security provider. This is what she said. The EU is a unique security provider. And she insisted there will be missions where NATO and the UN will not be present, but where the EU should be. So I wonder if this would mean the decline of NATO and a US military involvement model of intervening in order to bring peace to countries in conflict. Apart from the political statements, we have to see how the EU will react in practice and it is still a mystery. On the other hand, it is true that for next year, the French presidency have announced that there will be a conference as regards to the role of the EU in military aspects in the world, but we will have to see again, another pending subject. The seventh feature is connected with the UN Security Resolution, and particularly Resolution 2593, which was passed last August with the abstention of China and Russia. The text of the resolution is very short. It is not usual to see so short resolutions taking into account, in this case, the complicated situation they had to deal with. The resolution is dominated by two main issues. One is the condemnation of the acts of terrorism. In fact, the Security Council strongly condemned the deplorable attacks that took place near the international airport in Kabul by the end of August, which resulted in deaths and injuries to over 300 civilian and 30 military personnel. This is the first paragraph of the resolution. And again, in the subsequent paragraphs, the Security Council demands that Afghan territory should not be used to threaten or attack any country or to shelter or train terrorists. So this means that this was an issue on which the Security Council state members agreed. We have to condemn the acts of terrorism, and precisely the attack to the airport of Kabul. On the other hand, the other issue which dominates the resolution is the issue of humanitarian assistance. This is because humanitarian assistance is more or less an impartial issue on which member states can find a consensus. It has nothing to do with humanitarian assistance as such, the aid the population needs, with human rights in general, which it's much more a political issue. To ask for a humanitarian response to the international community is not politically dangerous to anyone. Anyway, there are some issues which were ignored and excluded in that resolution and which was very striking. For example, in this case, the resolution does not mention if the situation is a threat to the peace or an act of aggression or something which would lead to the Security Council to adopt some measures based on Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. I mean, take some responsibilities and initiate another mission, which would also lead to accountability. It is a resolution without teeth. There is not consequences if the resolution is not complied by the member states. Some questions which were also missing were, for example, that the resolution refers to the safe, secure, and orderly departure from Afghanistan of Afghans and all foreign nationals. The resolution invites the population to leave, but it does not mention a secure stay. I mean, and what will happen with the people who want to remain? They do not mention anything about a safe stay or remain or living in the country. This is one thing I was missing, I missed. And one crucial issue, which is deliberately ignored, is how can an Afghan citizen flee from their country if they do not have any emphasis to apply for a visa? How are they living? I mean, you are inviting them to flee and they have no channels to flee. The only channel is the Pakistan borders. And Pakistan has already said that they have 4 million refugees. They cannot host any more refugees in their country. So which is the way they can flee? I mean, it is an invitation which does not think about the consequences of that invitation. And the last question I wanted to mention, the last point, which also needs a reflection or from the point of view of the doctrine of international law, because international lawyers have not still dedicated much reflection or careful thoughts, is the one of the withdrawal as such. I mean, the departure of the exit from a territory. As you know, early this week, the Secretary of State had to justify in the US Congress that the withdrawal of the US and other NATO states from Afghanistan was the only solution. He was submitted to an scrutiny in this sense. The most evident consequence of the removal is that the Taliban confirmed its control. You can see there in the map. I mean, the dark brown is the situation in which the territory is controlled by the Taliban. I mean, so they are controlling the country, and they even announced the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. International law does not provide any straightforward answer as regards to withdrawals. The assessment may oscillate between two different ideas or ideologies or philosophies. One of them is the defense of continued presence. I mean, we have the responsibility to protect, therefore we have to remain there. And the other one, the restoration of the respect for state sovereignty and national self-determination in the face of neo-colonialist and imperialistic arrangements when the security of a country depends on foreign troops. They are two different visions. We have to leave because we are being neo-colonialist, or we have to stay because we have to protect the population. Not only is the question of how to intervene and what to do, but what to do when you leave and how to leave. The cases of Iraq, Libya, and Syria, for example, do not offer any good lesson. There is, in fact, one very interesting study or project led by Richard Kaplan, Exit or something like this, the Exit or Exit, Ways of Exit, which is being run now by Professor Richard Kaplan from the University of Oxford. But it is one of the few studies I have found about withdrawals. Anyway, rather than being a mere consequence of the US withdrawal, the Taliban's takeover can be traced back to the 2020 agreement between the former government of the United States and the Taliban. This agreement announced a timeline for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan. They established a timeline. The 2020 agreement raises interesting questions of state responsibility. Does, in this case, international law prescribe any responsibility for the US when, through this agreement, not only facilitated the arrival of the Taliban to power, but actively invited them to it? To address this, we need to look to the agreement, and I will ask you to read the name of the agreement, the title. It says, Agreement for Bringing Peace to Afghanistan between two parties which are not Afghanistan, between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and the title says, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban and the United States of America. So strictly, it is an agreement that seeks to bring peace to Afghanistan, which is not party in the agreement. The 4-page agreement, in addition to announcing a timeline for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan, includes other points. One of them is, for example, the ceasefire. The other one is the release of Taliban prisoners. The other one, which is very important, is the initiation of negotiations between the Taliban and what are described as Afghan sides. And it is an agreement over the future political roadmap of Afghanistan. So in this agreement, they are talking about a constitutional change of the territory of the regime. The question raised here is if the US bear any responsibility for entering into an agreement with the Taliban with such a context and without the inclusion of the Afghan actors in the agreement. This lets me think about the prohibition of intervening in the internal affairs of states. In this case, it is a quite clear attack to the Afghan sovereignty as such. So the question would be if there is any state responsibility, in this case, not of the Taliban and not of the Afghanistan, but of the United States because of the signing this agreement, which is a document. There is a proof here. The assessment could also go deeper and think about that the Taliban, they are, as I said before, declared and listed as a terrorist group in the Security Council resolution signed, among others, by United States, because United States is part of the Security Council. So this was the last point I wanted to mention. The conclusion, and in order to finish my intervention, is that I have tried to point out or to share with you some of the conceptual boundaries from which we'll have to move away in order to build a more flexible, a more dynamic and friendly international law, because as you have seen, there are a lot of boundaries still. How to build it? It's the million-dollar question. And the answer, dear friends, is in your creativity and your wonderful minds. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today. My name, as you heard, is Linda Wood. I'm a U.S. attorney. I'm also an arbitrator and mediator and negotiator. I worked for 7 years in Afghanistan. I lived and worked in Kabul. I've been associated with Afghanistan since February 22nd, 2008. Happens to be the birthday of the United States' first president, George Washington. So I remember it well. And I remember the day I first arrived in Afghanistan and how impressed I was by, first of all, the stunning beauty of the most mountainous country in the world. What I want to share with you today is really following up on some of the things that you just heard about the challenges that the international community faces in engaging Afghanistan under the Taliban to follow what the international community believes is the way to peace and stability and to prosperity. I'm going to try not to be too negative, but I think it's very, because I'm a pretty optimistic person. But having worked in Afghanistan, there are many things I understand about the country that I would like to relay to you today, because I think it's important for anyone who's concerned about how the international community can engage the Taliban government to understand some of the basic facts about the country itself. You know, if you're ever going to go into a negotiation, which is what this is, you want to know as much as you can about the person you're negotiating with. And in this case, the international community wants to be able to negotiate peace, stability, wants to be able to bring in food, medicine, and basic supplies so that people in Afghanistan don't suffer any more than they already are. The international community also wants to bring to Afghanistan human rights, which we in the Western world, in democratic societies, consider fundamental to living a decent life. Those are all goals. But what does the Taliban want? What do we as an international community have to give the Taliban that's going to motivate them, to persuade them to cooperate and to, if not sign these treaties, these declarations of human rights, at least to abide by some of the basic standards of decency? And that's a question that I put out to you. And I think we need to keep coming back to, how is it we're going to work with a government when one of the ministers who was just named in the Taliban government is on the US terror list? And as you've just heard, the country itself, the Taliban itself, is being run by people who are considered terrorists. So how do you negotiate with them? How do you persuade them? And my starting point, as I've said, is always, what do we know about them? So what I'd like to do in the few minutes that I have with you is to share some basic facts about Afghanistan. And I apologize to those who already know quite a bit about the country. But for those of you who don't, I'm going to share some of what I learned over my years there. And then I'm going to talk about 4 friends of mine, Afghan lawyers, who still are in Afghanistan and are trying to get refugee status so that they have no longer to live under the threat of the Taliban. And so their families no longer have to live under that threat, and the challenges they're facing. And the news that they bring me every single day, multiple times a day, about what is actually happening in Afghanistan that we don't necessarily see on television or hear about on the radio. So let me start off with just some basic facts. You might have heard that Afghanistan's called the graveyard of empires. But what does that mean? And why is that true? Well, it's called the graveyard of empires because the empires that tried to invade and take it over and control it, that is the Soviet Union, the Brits 3 times, and the United States have colossally failed. So why have they failed? Why has it been so difficult for anyone to invade, to control, to tame Afghanistan, if you will? And the answer is that for a few reasons. One is there's no national identity among the Afghan people. I remember hearing that the first president of Afghanistan, who was, I will say, a puppet of the United States government, was in his first speech talked to the Afghan people about feeling that they have a nation, because he recognized that they didn't have this sense of unity. That was a problem then, and it's a problem now. Afghanistan is a tribal area. There are 14 tribes, and their loyalties to one another. Another challenge with Afghanistan, the reason that it's never been conquered and is difficult to unite, is because there's no place for a central government to really control the country. Kabul is, of course, the capital, but the rest of the country, which is almost twice the size of Germany, is incredibly mountainous. There's not much of an infrastructure. Until recently, there wasn't even a road completely around the country. And it doesn't have the infrastructure for good communication. So that's why it's difficult. It's very isolated, very inaccessible. And for these reasons, it's been ruled by what we call warlords, or local, very local government. I'm not sure how that will ever change, because you can't change the basic geography of a country, although we've made some progress by improving roads and communication and infrastructure. Another serious problem with uniting Afghanistan is that the needs are great in that country, are phenomenally great, and the resources are minuscule. It's a landlocked country, so it has no access to any waterway, which makes trade difficult. But it also has very few natural resources. One resource you might have heard about is gems, precious and semi-precious gems. And it's true that they exist. The United States government has sent military planes to examine where those gems are. And unfortunately, they're hidden deep within the rocks. Not all of them, but most of them. So those are the resources. What about the needs of the people? About half of the adults in the country cannot read or write. And that's a vast improvement over 20 years ago, when it was more like only 20% of the population can read or write. And we're talking about judges and lawyers as well. So illiteracy, lack of education, is a huge concern, as is medicine, as is health. Afghanistan has one of the highest rates of infant mortality, which is a way of measuring the health of a country. In the entire world, it usually ranks 1 or 2. I'm going to just highlight a few of the highlights of the recent history in Afghanistan, the political history. So you not only have a sense of socially and culturally and economically what's going on, but politically as well. As you know, Afghanistan was ruled by a king for quite a number of years. And during this period of the kingdom in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, it was a pretty modern country. Women did not wear headscarves. Women wore mini skirts. You've probably seen pictures on social media of this, and you're shocked. And I was shocked because I didn't know a country could go backwards. I'd never experienced that in my own country, although maybe I've recently experienced the sense of going backwards in terms of human rights and in terms of personal freedoms. But in Afghanistan, the difference was so stark. When I saw pictures of women in the yearbook at the law school, and someone one of the professors showed me the yearbook, and he said, "What do you notice about this yearbook?" And there were pictures of boys and girls together, and none of the women wore headscarves. So the country has really changed. After the king was overthrown, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union came in, and then after that, there was a civil war, which I'm sure you've heard about with the Mujahideen. And then the Taliban took over for a short period of time. And then for the last 20 years, the United States has led the coalition to try to bring stability and peace and human rights to Afghanistan. We all know how that's ended. After 20 years and $3 trillion US and countless lives lost, countless people maimed, the Taliban have come back. The last president, the one who just fled, was Ashraf Ghani. Again, I call him a puppet of the United States government because we were the ones who essentially selected in our own way who would be the president. Now, he's a very smart man. If you know anything about him, he's a Fulbright scholar. He has a PhD. He studied finance. He worked for the UN. He worked for the World Bank. And in fact, he co-wrote a book which was called Fixing Failed States. So if anybody was supposed to save Afghanistan, it was going to be President Ghani. But where is he now? In the 20 years that the United States and its coalition partners, NATO, was in Afghanistan, during those years, there were many people who acknowledged the limitations of the international community's ability to help Afghanistan as foreigners. There are many people who at the time, over the last 20 years, saw that this was going to be a failure. So when I hear people say, oh, we didn't know it wasn't working out very well, well, that's just not true. I know that from firsthand experience. And you can read now countless articles that were written at the time. And one of the problems was there was no will, or very little will, by the leaders of Afghanistan. And there was very little buy-in and participation and understanding of what human rights are, what the importance of freedom of speech, of education, from the citizens of Afghanistan itself. And so to me, if we construct any kind of strategy going forward as an international community, we have to engage whoever the leaders might be, and we have to engage the citizens of the country. And that's not going to be easy. But I don't think we can deny those facts, or we're not going to be able to succeed again. And there were successes. I always like to talk about the successes because it makes me feel like I was an important part of the history of Afghanistan, that I've actually spent a little bit of my career improving something in the world. And I don't want to think that when Ghani fled, that all of the successes fled along with him. I'd like to think we've left something sustainable behind. The reason that we did have success in our project, which was a rule of law project, let me back up and tell you what I did there. The United States government spent quite a bit of money in Afghanistan, not only on military, but also on development in roads and infrastructure. We built courthouses and hospitals and things like that, along with other people in the international community. Italy and Germany and France and Netherlands and many, many countries contributed to the successes in Afghanistan. It wasn't just the United States, but I can speak from personal experience about what the United States did. And our rule of law project was there with the purpose of educating judges, defense lawyers, prosecutors, police, prison guards on what human rights were, how they need to be protected, and how each person in that, what we call justice actor group, was responsible for ensuring human rights. So we told them, basically gave them lessons, and we mentored them and supported them so they could stand up a functioning courthouse and a democratic system and educate the public on their right to their right to expect that their government would preserve and protect their rights. That's what we did. We could never have done it without the help of Afghan lawyers. What we did is we knew in the United States, as in Great Britain and Germany and many other countries, that any Afghan who helped the foreigner was going to be at risk by the Taliban and also maybe looked at suspiciously by their fellow Afghans, because the only time Afghanistan has ever united all of these tribes together is when they face a foreigner. And that's when they can unite. And that's how they have united. And unfortunately, the lawyers on our project and many other projects where there were people, Afghans helping foreigners, they've become targets of the Taliban. Their lives have been threatened. So when we started this, the international community decided we needed to protect those people. If we were going to ask them to help us because they knew the language, because they knew the culture, because they often knew these people generation after generation. Somebody's father was a judge or a minister in the government. So we needed those connections. We needed that cultural understanding. We needed that understanding of the politics and of course of the language. So we used them, we paid them well, and then we offered to give them visas if they ever needed to leave Afghanistan. You've probably heard about the special immigrant visa that the United States offers. It's similar to one that's being offered by military translators in Great Britain. All of the people I'm about to tell you about were lawyers who worked on our project, and all of them have applications for this special immigrant visa to the United States. One of them has been waiting 6 years to process that visa. One of the reasons was because the former president of the United States decided he didn't want any more immigrants in our country. And so for a full year, there was never a single interview held, which is a mandatory step in the process. Never a single interview held. So this man who was waiting for 6 years to get his SIV interview finally got his SI interview. And he wrote me and said, I have an interview at the US Embassy in Kabul on September 29th. And I celebrated with him. It meant that he and his family could leave. A few days later, the United States pulls out of the embassy and takes cover at the airport. So there is no embassy to go to for his SIV interview, which is supposed to happen in just a few days. Let me tell you about these friends. That's one of them. I call them my friends. They were my coworkers. In fact, I was their boss. We had 100 people on the project, and we covered the entire country with the work that we were doing to train judges, police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and so on. I'm going to tell you not only who they are, but I'm going to also tell you what's happening right now in Afghanistan through their eyes, through their emails, through their Skype messages to me, through our telephone calls. One of them is named Sultani. He trained defense lawyers. He was thrown in prison when he was on our project by corrupt police who collaborated with Taliban. And this is when the United States was actually still in the country. He's the one that has an interview scheduled at the non-existent Kabul embassy. He has 5 daughters in his family. Ibadi is another one. Ibadi trained judges on their ethical obligations in a democracy. And he was a counter-narcotics prosecutor before he came to our project. And I remember hiring him. He could hardly speak English, but I was super impressed by the fact that he put in prison high Taliban officers who he caught and brought evidence against in trials, and put them into prison for life sentences. He also, as you can imagine, received a lot of death threats. Unfortunately, those Taliban prisoners are now out on the street because you might remember that the Taliban opened all the prison gates. All those doors are open and all those people fled, and they're all on the street and they're all looking for him. Another friend, it just makes me want to cry. Another friend, Hamid, trained judges for us on the project. He also trained law professors. He worked for several NGOs before he came to our project, including the Italian government. So he has a long history of working with the international community, 15 years, as a matter of fact. And Nekmat Mehmet is the youngest one. He's 38 years old. He doesn't have a wife. He's in love with his truck. And he studied in the United States. He received an LLM. All of them have received in the past death threats and are actively receiving death threats. And that's why they've all applied for and should be accepted as Afghans who qualify for the SIV. All four of them saw their country collapsing. It amazes me that there are people in the United States and in other countries who say, oh, we didn't see this coming. Really? Then you weren't reading, your eyes weren't open. My time is probably getting close to up, so I just need to tell you a few things about the day-to-day happenings in Afghanistan and how these four wannabe refugees are having a hard time getting out. A few days before Ghani left, Hamid wrote me and he said, Linda, we're all going to die. We're not sleeping. We're moving every night from one place to another. And Sultani writes me and he says, terrible things are happening in this country because of the stupid President Ghani and his corrupt team. My country is burning. I don't know what will happen next. And then Sultani sends me some good news, which was well received. The United States takes control of the Kabul airport and countries are evacuating some people. And of course, these four, like many of their countrymen, are hoping that they're going to get on one of those evacuation flights. He tells me that a group called 14 lawyers from Spain are trying to identify prosecutors, police, judges, to bring to Spain to give them visas here so that they at least have a safe haven for a period of weeks while they sort out where they're going to go and find a country that will take them as refugees. Maybe it'll be the United States, they hope. Maybe they can make some progress on their SIVs, they hope, but they need to get out of the country. Sultani forwarded me the letter that he got from 14 lawyers, coincidentally from Spain. Quote, we're trying to take lawyers, prosecutors, and judges from Afghanistan, although we can't promise anything. We have to include your names on a list to the Spanish foreign minister and the justice minister. We have to move quickly. We need your passport and your email address, please. So Sultani asked me, is this real? Or is this some kind of joke? Or is this the Taliban trying to get this information from us? And I said, send me do you have a phone number for them? Send me the phone number. And he did. And I called and I spoke with Chuko, who actually is a graduate of Deusto. He's a law graduate. He's not practicing law right now, but he's one who's organized this group. And I said, yes, it's real. And go ahead and get these documents. And Hamid responds to me and he says, the documents, well, Linda, I'm far away from home and I can only travel at night and I don't carry any documents with me and I don't put them on my phone. It's too dangerous. The situation here gets worse every day. This morning, the Taliban broke into a journalist's home to kill him and they couldn't find him. You might have read about this. They couldn't find the journalist. He'd already left Afghanistan. So they killed the relatives that were living with him. This is how the Taliban extracts justice. If they can't bring pain to you directly, they'll do it by killing your relatives. A few days later, there's more good news that 14 lawyers got my friend's approval, a letter to get them into the airport and on an evacuation plane. And the letter says, please find attached your safe conduct letter and instructions on how to get the evacuation flight from Kabul. And please go to the Abbey Gate today, August 25, as soon as possible. The planes will leave Kabul August 25, 26, and 27. Signed, emergency counselor for the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the instructions also said, quote, wear red and yellow, tops, shirts, hats. Of course, the colors of Spain, so that the Spanish guards can see you and help you get inside. Well, all 4 lawyers tried and failed to get in. As you know, the airport, getting into the airport was a chaotic mess. And Nekmat wrote to the 14 lawyers and he said, "Dear sir," I love it. He's so polite. His life's in danger. And he writes, "Dear sir, as instructed by you, I went to the airport, but to the large number of people, it's impossible to make an insider to reach the Spanish army. I'm putting my life at risk if I go there again. After hours of trying, I returned home. I'm waiting for further instruction." And then Hamid writes me the same day with a similar experience. "We can't get inside the airport. We're desperate to leave. The Taliban are beating people who are waiting at the gate, but still, we're trying." The next day, August 26th, Hamid sends me a message, "OMG, oh my God. A bomb just exploded at the Abbey Gate. How is that possible? Where my feet were standing last night with my entire family, now it's full of dead bodies." So the airport shut down, as you know, and no flights, no evacuation flights occurred, or very few over the next 3 days. And Spain, of course, along with most other countries, left. They left with their planes, and they left without my friends being on those evacuation flights. So Spain comes up with Plan B. And that plan is for these Afghans to get a visa, to get into Pakistan, and from Pakistan, go to the Spanish embassy in Islamabad and pick up visas from Spain and fly to Spain. Well, there's a few problems with that. One is that the borders were closed for a long time. Another one is that it was very difficult. As you've mentioned, there's no embassies that were operating to get visas. And another problem was extortion. And Sultani tells me, before the Taliban, visas to Pakistan were free. Now it costs equivalent of 200 euros per person. Fortunately, just yesterday, I got good news from Sultani and a few others that they were able to find a way to get a cheaper visa into Pakistan. But then he writes and he says, "Oh, I just learned that the Pakistan border is open, but in order to get in, you now have to pay something called a gate pass fee. A gate pass fee is 290 euros per person. Ibadi has 9 people in his family. Sultani has 8. Where are they getting the money? They took out cash. They've been taking out cash. They've been keeping their salaries that the US government paid them in cash because they knew, even though the international community says, and the United States government says, they didn't know that Taliban were going to take over. Well, my friends knew it, and anybody with their eyes open knew it. So fortunately, maybe the only thing that saves them is that they have cash, but they still can't make the trip. So where's the United States government in all of this? What's their country doing for them, the country they work for, that they actually put their lives on the line for? Well, I'm sorry to say there's no interest there. I have been on the phone, hardly sleeping for the last 3 weeks, trying to be the intermediary between my friends in Afghanistan and the United States government, calling our former employer that made who knows how much profit through the labor of these Afghans. Do you have any money to give them any airplane tickets? I've called the lawyers, the international lawyers. I've called lawyers in my own state, American Bar Association lawyers, Afghan American Association lawyers, every NGO I can think of, including the International Refugee Committee, everybody. And the answer is always, wow, we're really impressed with the work you're doing. Sorry, we can't help you. Maybe you should, and one of them said, ask the Spanish lawyers to contribute. This is our mess. This is our problem. And they have been abandoned, I'm sorry to say. How am I doing? 5 minutes, okay. I want to tell you about human rights now. So this is the situation that they're in. They still haven't left. Their lives are in danger. What's it like every day for the other Afghans that are there? The ones that have to stay, don't have any visas, don't know anybody who speaks English. There's no way out. Well, I'm sorry to say that you've probably heard the international community and certainly United States government say, well, we don't know what we're going to do yet with the Taliban government, even though one of the ministers, is on the US hit list. We don't know yet what we're going to do because we want to see if this Taliban is any different from the last Taliban. They call it Taliban 2.0. Well, I don't know where these guys are living, but I do know what's happening in Afghanistan. Women, as you probably have heard, are only allowed to work in certain sectors of the economy. They can teach, but they can't teach. Women cannot teach men. Girls can go to school, but they can't be in classes with men and they can't be taught by any males. Men and women, even at the university, are separated. And of course, you've all heard, women must cover up. They can only go out if they are accompanied by a male in their family. And in fact, Taliban just recently said the cricket team, the Afghan cricket team, can no longer play that sport, or you cannot play any sport if you're a woman and your skin is exposed. You have to be covered because otherwise it's not Afghan. So that's the situation. And men are hardly any better. They all have to, of course, grow beards. Hamid reported to me, forced marriages are still taking place. And he said, I don't want my daughters taken by force into marriage. And Sultani reports that a famous folk musician was murdered because he was playing music that wasn't religious. So the Taliban killed him. And on Monday, just this week, Sultani texts me and he says, Rasai Badakhshai was murdered 2 days ago, a martyr for humanity. And I didn't know who she was. And so before I responded, I Googled her. She was 26 years old. She was the person who organized the protests of women that you might have read about or seen or heard about in Herat and in Kabul. That was the woman who organized that. And she was interviewed by Al Jazeera just last week or 2 weeks ago. And she says, quote, we were calm and careful, but the Taliban wanted to stop us at any cost. How are women supposed to have the rights that the Taliban promised us if we're not in decision-making roles in the government or talking to the Taliban? And that's why she went to protest. Sultani, I wrote back, Sultani, what a brave woman she was, but there's nothing in the news about her. There's nothing about her murder. And he tells me, Linda, she's suddenly disappeared. And unfortunately, there are many things happening here that never get into the news. So now you know what it's like for these people who are trying to get out, the difficulties they face, and the challenges and difficulties that the people in Afghanistan face. And so as we talk about strategies of how to engage the Taliban government so that they will respect human rights, so that the people in their country can prosper, I think it's important to keep these stories in mind and be realistic about what those expectations could be. Because if we're not realistic about what is going on in the country, we're doomed to repeat the errors of many empires which have fallen in Afghanistan. With good heart, many people have tried, but they failed. So I hope we can end this conference with at least some energy to try to resolve these problems and to try to think about solutions in a way which we've never been challenged to think about before. So with that, I'll leave you and look forward to having any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Linda, for your moving presentation based on your own experience. Well, now we have 20-25 minutes for questions, answers, comments, reactions to both to what Joanna has developed or to the presentation by Linda. So the floor is open.
My question will be addressed to Professor Linda. Thank you for the presentation, but I did not agree with you on one step. You were only on one side, only on the negative aspect of Taliban. You have not outlined the atrocities committed by the US soldiers. And I, as a student, we have been trained to carry on right analysis. And you are already bringing us to follow wrong analysis because the US soldiers committed atrocities in the field. But you totally do not mention about the atrocities of the US soldiers. My second question, in reality, America is a secular state. It's a secular country. It means that there's a separation of the state from the religion. And you agree with me. But when you go to Afghanistan, it's a state which is based on Sharia law. And US cannot impose its ways of doing things to a sovereign state, a state which is based on Sharia law. It is totally different. It will always create war. And you abide with me that the interference, the US policy can never operate, can never work in Afghanistan. When you look like, for instance, the UN that was built on the Western model, and you bear with me that no colonial country was there during the creation of the UN. And what I discovered during your presentation was that you want to take a model that is in US and impose to Afghanistan. Let me take for instance, Afghanistan is based on the system where you cannot accept, for instance, homosexuals, you cannot accept lesbians. You know that. But in the US, you accept those people. You see, you have to, by respecting the culture, and I was really impressed with when Pope Francis said about the respect of the Afghanistan culture. The Pope Francis, I think, during one of his message, he calls on the respect of the Afghanistan culture, and even President Putin called on the US to respect the Afghanistan culture. I think bringing the US model to Afghanistan is a failure. I think, what is the US doing to promote the culture of these people? Thank you.
First of all, I want to apologize if you thought I was defending the actions of the United States government. I don't. The reason that I was focusing on Afghanistan is because we don't have enough time in the day really to talk about the atrocities the United States government has committed in Afghanistan and continues to commit in terms, including bombing innocent people and denying it and covering it up. I mean, it could go on and on about the atrocities the United States government has committed in Afghanistan, but I thought we were talking about ways to engage Afghanistan, the international community. And the second thing I want to say is that you're right. One of the reasons the United States government and other empires have failed in Afghanistan is because of this lack of understanding. And that's why what I wanted to talk about today was what Afghanistan is like. And we, again, didn't get into a lot of their values and so on and so forth. And yes, it is an Islamic country. But there are many Muslims who do not believe that Taliban represents the religion. And I'm not here to judge that because I frankly am not an expert on Islam. But again, I apologize if what you thought I was saying was that the United States model of approaching Afghanistan was a model which we should replicate, because I don't believe that that's true. And I hope that answers your question. Thank you for your comments, by the way. I'm glad that you felt strong enough to be able to articulate that to me.
Next question, please.
Yeah. As for me, to slightly follow up on what has just been said, but from a slightly more, let's say, universalistic perspective, I feel like when we mention Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires, we need to always think about the US intervention, as many claim, as a continuation of the Soviet one, meaning an essay of configuring a modern Western state following up on our conception of the UN, composed of states, never of tribes, never of emirates, no, states in the modern term. Many have talked about how the Afghanistani government, which was created, was extremely centralized as opposed to Afghanistan's tribal and pluralistic nature. Even the Sharia law has often been interpreted in monistic terms, trying to focus it on a single legal code when it has not traditionally. So my question is, those lawyers you worked with, those attorneys, all those people you worked with, to which degree didn't they feel like what was being built was completely off the ground? To which point the same mistakes were being made as detail. The men who decided to invade Afghanistan, Iraq, and indirectly or directly in the case of Libya, but indirectly in the case of Syria, none of them had the slightest idea of what Islamic culture meant. Probably none of them had any clue about Arab history or Islamic history, yet they got to make that choice and they got to teach the world how things were done. And it's tragic because when you think about ethics and you think about law, you want to make it as universal as possible. And I think no one will stop to feel bad about the situation of women, people who supported you, who worked with you in Afghanistan. Yet at the end, you think about it and you say, okay, what's the other way around, which doesn't imply invading and committing those atrocities? It's the tragedy of the modern way of involving yourself in those places. You go in with a military force and you make everyone your own way. So my question is, as I repeated, did you not feel like it was all from the beginning being born dead on the inside? The whole try to change it so much, the country itself? Thank you.
Well, the world isn't black and white. And many times you try to make the best of a situation which isn't perfect. I wasn't proud of many of the things the government did when I was in Afghanistan, and I'm not proud of them today. But I did believe in their goal of bringing human rights to Afghanistan within the context of their religion and their culture. And I did believe in giving women and girls an equal education. So acid was not being thrown in the faces of young girls. In the last 20 years, there were atrocities for sure and violations of human rights, but it was looked down upon. And I think that's how those Afghans who helped the foreigners can go to sleep at night, that things did improve, that literacy improved, that the lives, the conditions upon which people were living, not only in the city, but also in the small villages, were also improved by the building of roads and new hospitals and access to justice with judges who could read and write. And those were significant improvements. And I'd like to think that they will stay. And I'm sorry that these Afghans, frankly, they're the last ones to leave. Many of the people over the last 5 years that I know who worked on our projects already left. But these were the ones who didn't give up and didn't want to give up and wanted to interpret the Western ideals into their own and integrate them into their own culture. So I don't think they have a difficult time going to sleep at night. And I don't feel like they feel that they are enemies of the Afghan people.
Well, I would like to begin by, thanking the panel. I think this is a fantastic conversation and one that I think is going to be extremely important within the coming months and probably years. My question is, I think that a lot of the conversations that we've been having about Afghanistan and the Middle East in general come with a predisposition of the United States being inherently involved, whether that be through military intervention or in the negotiation table. My question is, should the US actually be involved in that in the future, right? With negotiating with the Taliban in the future, trying to involve them and implore them to sign different treaties. Does the US deserve, after the amount of atrocities that it's committed within Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, et cetera, does the US deserve a seat at the table? Also keeping in mind, the amount of collective trauma that Afghans have experienced because of direct US intervention. Can anything actually be, progressed and actually be achieved through US negotiations?
So much for your question. I was also wondering about what should be the role of United States, I mean, for the next years or even decades, and for the European Union as such, I mean, for European states. And I don't have the answer, but I still believe that we have an inclination to help and to dialogue. I mean, there is a need of having a dialogue with them, even if they are Taliban or even if they are, I mean, practicing practices or conducts which are totally opposite of what our way of seeing or living or understanding life. So I mean, I would say yes. I mean, they should be there. I don't know which is the way. It's of course not physically again, because this has been a disaster. But on the other way, I was thinking that there have been quite good examples of interventions through the UN. For example, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Cambodia, where there were also failures, but the countries are better after the intervention. So I have to tell you, I did my PhD on humanitarian intervention 20 years ago, and I still did not reach to any conclusion. I mean, sometimes I think that the responsibility to protect should be a customary international law, and everybody, I mean, the international community should engage institutionally. But other times I think that it's always a failure, this kind of intervention. So there is still a need of thinking about or looking at which examples have been successful. And this is, if I would be an advisor to the US government, I would say, or I would just suggest to make an analysis and assessment of what did the UN institutionally, through the Security Council resolution, through a procedure, which is the UN Charter, what did the UN do through the peacekeeping operation in El Salvador, which was a good idea and which executed, and which was, I mean, the establishment of the rule of law. And what can we copy? What can we take of these good experiences? I don't know if I answered, but this is my idea.
But before Cristina takes the floor, I'd like to follow up on your comment on, well, humanitarian intervention, that the very idea of humanitarian intervention, I think, has been very much negatively impacted, especially in light of the current crisis in Afghanistan. But you've mentioned the responsibility to protect. Do you think it's an adequate framework to deal with not only with Afghanistan, but now with Afghanistan and other crises that will come up in the future?
Well, Felipe, you know, I am a lawyer and I am a very positivist lawyer and strict in this sense. Responsibility to protect is an idea prompted and deployed by an international commission from Canada. It's not still law, it's not anywhere established. It has been used by the Security Council when they have been, thinking, they have thought that it was an interesting instrument. But there are a lot of situations in which there is a responsibility to protect and the international community did not respond. So, I mean, the responsibility to protect is like a makeup of international humanitarian, humanitarian intervention. It was created when NATO failed in Serbia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because of the humanitarian interventions from NATO were not very well considered by the political or international community or public opinion. So they invented another word, which is still not working. It has been developed, and there are like some theories now or degrees. I mean, if there is a genocide, we could intervene even without the Security Council resolution, which is very dangerous. So I will pay attention of the development of the figure, and I will strict any action to the UN Charter, because I mean it's quite useful. The question is that it is not being contemplated, understood.
Well, thank you, Joanna and Judy, for your very provocative interventions. And I was also struck by the intervention, from some of the intervention. I was wondering if to say something or not. And now that Joanna, and I was thinking, I have to say first, I disagree with Joanna's last intervention. I will say, I think responsibility to protect is an emerging norm in international relations. And in fact, is the International Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention. What put forward was a framework on prevention, reaction, and post-conflict peace building. And this was not taken forward. But I will say the idea that those people that are not protected by their state, that the international community, because the evolution of international human rights law, of international humanitarian law, and this idea that all human beings should be protected is there. The international community has a responsibility. So I think in this regard is important, because changes the focus from intervention to protection of people. And I think it's there, and there has been some examples, and we always, unfortunately, Libya is not a good example, and we didn't do anything in Syria, and we are seeing that the international community, we are living, I mean, we are not doing it. I mean, we are not doing what we should have done in Afghanistan. But the question you mentioned, I mean, for me, and I think it's more, I'm reflecting more than doing a question which I usually hate from other people in conferences. So I'm sorry for that. But I wanted to ask you, we are speaking about international interventions, but the US did intervene in Afghanistan unilaterally, although later supported by a coalition of states. But the multilateral intervention, I will say the best example is the UN International Mission in Afghanistan, which is an integrated stabilization mission, which has as an objective promoting human rights and trying to support the creation of a state. And I will say we could discuss if these 2 decades of liberal interventionism, where we've been trying to promote a model of a state that is probably not supported in all areas of the world. But this has been supported, and we have to say, by the General Assembly, where we have today 193 states, so all the states of the world, and the Security Council with all its limits, because yes, it responses to the international order of the Second World War. Still, the Security Council is, until we don't have other one, the organ that is trying to impose peace and security in the world. So I will say all these peace operations have the support of the international community at large. So for me, the question is, what is going to happen, and what do you think is going to be the role of the United Nations mission in Afghanistan? If you think this could be an opportunity to bring some, I don't know, to if the Taliban government, that I would like you to know which is your opinion. I think is de facto going to be recognized by the international community. So how do you think this is going to evolve? And if I may, I would like to I was hesitating to say, I think you made a very provocative intervention. Sorry, I didn't hear your name. Yeah, because you say the international intervention probably was an imposition of type of state that was not asked by the Afghanistan, but I would like to, but who has asked the Afghani people if they want Sharia law? I will say the problem here is always that the people are never asked what they want, both in this type of intervention. So thank you for making such a long intervention, but I felt removed by the different comments. Thank you.
Let me address first the comment that you made about Afghanistan being, if I understood correctly, an example of the international community working together, that it wasn't just a US effort. I would say in name, that's true. It had the appearance of being an international effort, but the United States has a lot of money, a lot of strong military, and often, from my experience, did things without consulting its coalition partners. And I hope that's one of the errors that we will correct going forward, because it's not just important to have, as they had on ISAF bases, flags of many different countries around the world that were providing aid of some sort of support to Afghanistan. That's great. But it needs to be a collaborative strategy, in my view, and I hope that that's what happens in the future. Because to your question about should the United States even have a place at the table, how do you keep a country as big, as rich, who likes to flex its muscles so much, away from the table? How do you keep them from intervening in countries? And so it really will take the international community putting pressure on the United States, just like they need to put pressure on the Taliban to respect rights. They need to put pressure on the United States, in my opinion, to be sure that it's not going forward with its own agenda and not respecting the viewpoints and the knowledge and advice of other countries in the world. To me, that's fundamental. And did anybody ask the Afghans if they wanted Sharia? I will say, in my experience, religion is important to them, and their Islamic religion is important to them, although there may not be a uniform view of what exactly the tenets of that religion are. And so there are countries around the world, not only Muslim countries, but Catholic countries and other countries that are based upon religious values. And Afghanistan happens to be one of them. And if that's what the Afghan people want, then they need to figure out what that looks like. And if they don't want it, frankly, they need to have a revolution.
For your intervention and for contradicting me. I have to tell you that as human, after the Christina's intervention, I assume that I am contradicting myself. I mean, my discourse was that we have to look for a very dynamic and flexible system or international legal order, and then I do not accept the responsibility to protect because it is not legally established and there is not a procedure. Yeah, everybody, I hope, has contradictions. And of course, I am the first one. So in this sense, what I would say is that, well, the idea of responsibility to protect, I mean, of course, it's a very good idea. The international community should protect the ones who are weaker or vulnerable. The question here is the procedure. I mean, who decides that we have the responsibility to protect? Which is the procedure? Again, the UN Security Council, and if the Security Council is blocked, because it is usually blocked, is the International Commission on Sovereignty from Canada, who is deciding? In law, procedures are very important. And this is what it's lacking now. This is what is missing, sorry, in this figure, in this feature of the responsibility to protect. So thank you for your comment, Christina, because this has led me, I mean, go to the detail. The problem is not the content, it's the procedure. On the other one, the question again was what to do again. And the focus in which I wanted to to focus, sorry for the repetition, on my speech was the withdrawal. The problem is how to live, not again what to do now. So, and there is a theory of the Commission on sovereign states. A theory developed by this Commission on the responsibility to protect. So let's develop a theory with a procedure, but also with a very clear system of withdrawals, of departures, because again, it would be another failure. And if the UN again would have a very good, a role or not, I was wondering, the Security Council can adopt a resolution saying that we will send troops to Afghanistan again, let's imagine, but the troops, sending troops is a voluntary decision of each state. And in this case, I see a very weak European Union organization as such, and even more individually states. Who will be the one who decides to send troops to Afghanistan now, and having soldiers killed by the Taliban due to a decision made by the government of one European country? So I think that they have a very difficult decision to make now, the ones, in the UN, and afterwards to decide, the defense ministers and foreign affairs ministers, if sending troops would be a good idea, taking into account their internal affairs, which in most of the cases in the European Union state members are questioned in a way.
We have time for two final questions. First, Fatuma, and then you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about way forward. My question is directed to Professor John. Let's talk about way forward for Afghanistan. You said something about recognition. So I was wondering, since Taliban is the government, I don't know how to put it, but I'll just say it's some sort of the government of the day. And clearly the outgoing Afghan government is not working anymore. And clearly we cannot, as international community, cannot ignore Taliban. So they have to either decide whether they are going to recognize it or completely ignore it and let the Taliban deal with Afghan however they like. Just to play a devil's advocate, I would like to ask, would it be so bad for the international community to recognize Taliban, seeing as, let's just take it from a legal point, where like a contract, because if two parties are in contract, it's in case of a breach, one can go sue or seek legal redress. So I feel like if the international community were to recognize Taliban, at least they can do something about them when they violate human rights, or they don't follow international law, or for example, Geneva Convention. So what do you think about it?
What we can see as regards to the news is that states are being very cautious as regards to the recognition of the new regime of the Taliban. I have not seen any very clear official and public recognition of the new government, which on the other side is very striking, because every state, at least in the Western or European states, declare that they are complying or adhere with the rule of law. So, why are they so cautious? And probably it is because they are thinking about the hope of a dialogue with the new government. I suspect that they are having doubts inside the foreign affairs officials or ministers of states. What do we do? Who begins? Who will be the one who says, I recognize? Remember the agreement signed by the US the Trump's administration and the one we were today, Islamic Emirate, Afghanistan. So the evidence, the proof is that there has not been a very clear statement on recognition, even if it is very clear that the Taliban are controlling effectively the territory. This must be because they are thinking about having a dialogue with them, even if they are violating, and this is also clear, human rights.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting talk. I was wondering, we were talking a lot now that it is important to respect the culture of the countries, in this case, Afghanistan, their way of life, Sharia law if they wanted. But on the other hand, we have human rights, and we talked about that it would be important that the Taliban recognize them in some way. However, human rights and some cultures, some traditions don't coincide. They are sometimes even the opposite. So how do we bring that together? What is more important, human rights or the culture that has existed for over 100 years, a million years, a million, 1,000 years? And how can we bring that together, or how should we move forward in the future?
In the United States, we didn't recognize the right of a man to marry another man or a woman to marry a woman until fairly recently. We didn't recognize the right of abortion until relatively recently. In fact, we were not one of the first countries on the face of the planet to decide slavery was wrong. The Brits were way ahead of the United States in that regard. But when you think about human rights, there aren't many people pointing the fingers at the United States and saying, you've denied human rights to people. We limit free speech in the United States. Is that a violation of human rights? And so really it's a continuum, is the way that I think about it. There's certain behaviors which we consider so far outside the norm that we're going to condemn them and condemn that country for those violations. And we don't have mass murdering in the United States. There is supposed to be a judicial process in the United States, even though we can point to violations of human rights even today. And the same thing is true with a country like Afghanistan. It may be an extreme now, with women having to cover their faces, with men having to grow beards, with Taliban forcing girls to marry them. There are many types of behavior which are extreme violations of human rights. But what's acceptable? The United States accepts countries like Saudi Arabia, where women couldn't drive. That's a violation of your right of movement. And so I think it's not an easy, like most of the things in this field of international relations or the law in general, it's difficult to have a black and white view of it. That's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you very much for your question. It is an anthropological question more than a legal one. I wanted to suggest you to read Sally Engel, who is an anthropologist and an international human rights lawyer, who talks about the transformation of the human rights language, because she says that the language of human rights is the language of the elite, and this is true. We cannot go with the civil and political covenant to Afghanistan and tell to the women, take into account that you have rights because of this treaty. That's impossible. So she defends that we should transform the human rights language or discourse in a much more easygoing or friendly discourse.
Yes, a very right comment about this process of vernacularization of human rights and international legal concepts. So yeah, good. So thank you very much for your attention, for your comments, and thank you, of course, to our two speakers, Joana Abrisketa and Linda Wood. I think they deserve an applause.